Hello! So, before starting the video, I'd advise watching Yojimbo and these things I'm going to talk about before watching this video, as I'm going to spoil most of them in the chapters. But if you're still interested in watching it like without knowing them, I'm just gonna start talking about them as chapters, so you can skip the ones that you might be interested in seeing, so I don't spoil anything if you're interested in that. So yeah, I will start the video. The story of how the 1961 film directed by Akira Kurosawa, Yojimbo, influenced the narrative and even entire shots of the 1969 film directed by Sergio Leone, A Fistful of Dollars, is a known one, to the point that it is not unusual that people refer to it as a remake, as the two films have more common elements than differences for the most part. It's still a good film, by the way. While it is easy to point at media with common elements or themings and call it a day, what I'd like to discuss here today is different. What I'm interested in is how using a known narrative as a reference or a base for a story can work in its favor for bringing new elements forth. I'd also like to start with a brief bit about how I write my videos, as I feel it might help with the viewing of this one. Usually my process involves already having at least a couple planned for the future, so that in each one I can anticipate points that will have more meaning in the next one. In the case of my last videos though, the big long ones, I've been actually presenting them in different order from what I originally planned. But in this case I thought it might work for better instead of doing a general video and then two specific ones. This is one of the specific ones, by the way. I arranged them with a scope getting wider, so it's easier to follow. So my first video is about Citizen Kane and Dragon Ball Super Broly, and it's about the hero character archetype. So it's a structure for the characters. And in this case, I would like to go for a story archetype, let's say. And in this case, I will go over the Yojimbo archetype. But anyway, before explaining the Yojimbo narrative, it might be easier if I explain in more detail what I mean by narrative archetype. So basically, some stories have similar elements in their structure. If you ever heard like the hero's journey or the Kishon Tenketsu, it can be something like that, like a loose structure that derives from how we tend to tell stories in a way not too dissimilar from the past story we heard. The Yojimbo narrative in this case can be found in reducing a plot of a film Yojimbo to its minimal aspects, and getting a story of two factions where a single third party arrives and usually brings them down by toying with both sides. So now that my intro is kind of done, I'd like to go over, bit by bit, some stories that were inspired by Yojimbo, stories that homage it, do the homage thing, and finally even ones that inspired it in the first place. So, as said a bit ago, comparing these two films is kind of shooting a dead horse in a barrel. But it's worth to check out, apart from the fact it's a good film, and even just the cultural conversion of the film is an interesting thing by itself. One key aspect of A Fistful of Dollars and Yojimbo is how both broke new grounds in the samurai and Old West genres, as both presented a new, dirtier and grittier version of the genres, opposed to the classic, almost semi-propagandistic white hat samurai cowboy ones, you know, which then inspired other creators to do similar things in their genres, like for example George Lucas with a space opera. Another interesting element of comparison is how both got spiritual sequels that went in different directions. On a final neat thing to talk about, Per un pugno di dollari, is how in interviews Kurosawa said that, alongside films like the one I'll talk about in the next segment, Yojimbo was mostly inspired by Old West films, which in a sense is an interesting cultural back and forth, you know. Cited directly by Kurosawa as an inspiration for Yojimbo, the inspiration can be easily seen, like there's even the funny henchman and the main character getting captured and escaping in a similar way.
Samurai Champloo.
Samurai Champloo is a 2005 animated series directed by Shinichiro Watanabe, and it's probably one of my favorite, if not my favorite show. Very early in the series, precisely in episode 3 and 4,
Hellhounds for Hire,
there is a Yojimbo inspired arc, with the main characters acting as the Toshiro Mifune character. This arc is actually quite important for the series' structure, as this early on they need to establish these characters well. So they used the familiar setting of a town torn between two Yakuza families as setting for the characters to do the character thing. As said before, this setting is used to bring out the characters through comparison and common elements with Mifune Toshiro's character, the nameless samurai. Mugen does it in the loud Mifune way, proving himself to one of the families with strength and by hurting someone's hand. This hand cut thing will become very indicative of Yojimbo references, so keep it in mind. Jin does it in the quiet Mifune way, by talking to locals and getting info and not getting initially involved. He also says the thing, which is asking if they want a bodyguard.
Yojimbo ni dou da? Ude wa ima miseru.
Yojimboを雇わぬか。腕は今見せる.
And he even doesn't not cut through his first enemies, which is a kind of a reference of how they didn't have blood effects in Chambara films yet. Finally, Fu does it in the broke Mifune way, as she is broke, like Mifune's character in Yojimbo. The thing is, like, more than her being the foil for Mifune, here she's doing more of her thing. Incidentally, she gives a lot of hints about her past, which are given like sporadically through the show. It's kind of one of the main hooks. The main thing is that Samurai Champloo does what it does best and then subverts the narrative so it doesn't go the usual way of the one guy turning two families apart from the inside thing. But it becomes actually a story of changing times and loyalty in crime. Samurai Champloo, by definition, is a show about subversion. The word Champloo is an Okinawa term used to refer to a mixture, like the Goya Champloo, a fish dish with bitter melon in it. It's representative of Okinawan culture and the series itself, a mixture of different elements that will at first seem at odds, but that complement each other to new heights. So this film exists, and like instead of an old setting, it's in the future with robots, which are just guys and they say they're robots. There's a guy without a body, he's like a head. They play football with his head and then he gets a body. I don't know. I stopped watching it. It wasn't good. It wasn't good at all.
Everybody say Illusion of Love!
Yuga Gotoku 5, aka Yakuza 5, works with the Yojimbo narrative in an interesting way, as it presents it reversed. You see, the main antagonist of the game, who is coincidentally called Kurosawa, during the course of the game is secretly inciting a war between the Kanto-based Tojo clan and the Hosaka-based Omi alliance, in the attempt of having them crashing upon each other. This isn't the only time where a Kurosawa film is a narrative or thematic inspiration for the plot points of the series. In Yakuza 7, for example, there are a lot of parallels with Tengoku no Jigoku and Donzuko. Like, there's a lot of characters just saying Donzuko a lot in the story. And there's also a character referred both as Yojimbo and saying that they don't know the name. But if I show them, it's an extremely enormous spoiler for Yakuza 7. So, if you know him, you know him. And the other two samurai games were not released in English. I'll get to them, but I imagine there's Kurosawa references there. I hope. I like them when they do it. I've already discussed this at high length in my Metal Gear Rising video, but Metal Gear Rising has a lot of references to samurai films, including Yojimbo and Sanjuro. And like Toshio Mifune's character, the main rival of the game, named Jetsu Sam, who also has kind of his appearance and mannerism, kind of based on the character, he ruins an evil organization from within. You can check more about this in my video on the matter, but to expand on what I said there, a reference as I haven't touched upon too much there is the arm cut, as cutting or injuring someone's arm is kind of a running gag of sorts within Yojimbo references. Golden Kamui is a very good series about different factions that are looking for runaway prisoners who have a combined map tattooing on the back that leads to a huge amount of gold of the Ainu people of Hokkaido. The series follows mainly the ex-soldier Sugimoto and the Ainu girl Ashipa, and oftentimes has small segments that are basically tutorials about hunting, camping, survival, and history of Japan. Very informing, has very brutal fights and very good men scenes. In a narrative arc that starts at chapter 55, one of the other groups who are looking for the gold, composed by Hijikata Toshizo and Okita Soji of the Shinsengumi, go in a town that, like in Yojimbo, is controlled by two families. It's got all of it: the arm cut, the price of service bartering, etc. And then comes Ogata, former soldier of the 7th Division. In the Yojimbo narrative, the ex-soldier Ogata kind of assumes the role of Tatsuya Nakadai's character, Unosuke, arriving at the midway point of the narrative, shooting a bell to show off his abilities, allying himself with one of the families and creating the duality of gun versus sword, which is iconic to Yojimbo. With this semi-standard set up, let's see how it develops. And yeah, it does develop interestingly, as straight away the son of the family Ogata works for, that in this case acts more like the guy who with a kidnapped wife, more than what in Yojimbo would Unosuke do. No, he proposes to end the feud right there, and then we get to the hostage exchange, which seems to go well, but then a twist happens. He attempts a Devil May Cry reboot Virgil moment, and then basically kills almost all the town leaders, sniping them from a high stool. This specific place is important to define Ogata's character in relation to Toshiro Mifune's Sanjuro, which is the fake name Toshiro Mifune assumes in these films. In Yojimbo, Sanjuro's plan in the story is to basically foment conflict between two parties in a stalemate, in the attempt to have them basically crash into each other. At an early point in the film, before Unosuke returns, the two families have a showdown in the main street, but it is comically apparent how incapable they both are. And while they are inching away at each other from a distance, Sanjuro is enjoying the show from up above and having a good old time. This also works in a sort of visual indicator of how much he is above them, and later on is recalled by Unosuke when he arrives at the midpoint of the narrative, shooting the bell. He's showing how dangerous he is and how good at shooting he is. And it reminds us of the high stool Sanjuro was at, and in a way is kind of challenging that original position. Ogata's presence on the stool, apart from being a clear reference to the film, has a different meaning here, as for him this place is just a good tactical vantage point. He is not interested in gloating about his adversary's inabilities. He is here for his objective, which he works to in an insanely clinical way about. I'll skip a bit to not waste your time, but all of the events lead up to the re-encounter of Ogata and the Hijikata faction. The final twist of the arc is then revealed, as for Ogata this entire conflict wasn't what we establish as the entire Yojimbo narrative with its different sections and everything, but for him is just the first bit where he shows his ability to get hired. So in the end it leads up to the fatigue question.
あんたらのことはよく知ってるぜ。腕の立つ用心棒はいらねえかい。土方歳三さん。
Another Westernish remake, this time they asked though. To differentiate itself from a Fistful of Dollars, it kind of goes for a more noir-ish tone. It's got all the Yojimbo things like the dead horse instead of a hand dog, fake names, he becomes friends with a barman, there's a hostage exchange, rain, sand, wind, a remix of a theme. Like in general it's an interesting film, but there's not a lot to talk about it. It's just, you know, remake. Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, which I thought for a long time it was called Yu-Gi-Oh! 5DS, like, you know, 5 Nintendo DS's in a row. It's an animated spin-off of the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga and anime series that started airing in 2008. In a way, if we were to summarize it briefly, it could be akin to a mixture of Megalobox, Initial D and Yu-Gi-Oh! In its futuristic settings, people started to play card games at high speed. The explanation of why, like outside of the narrative, is that a lot of animators that worked on Hokuto no Ken worked on this one too. Especially the late Yuji Kōkai, who passed away this year, that used to work on motorcycles and mechanical parts, which he really liked, as it seems he would make characters ride motorcycles whenever possible. So in 5Ds he's got a lot more free reign to do as he pleased, so a lot of mecha designs and motorcycle ensued. The setting of Neo Domino City is emblematic of gentrification and semi-totalitarian state control, with futuristic skyscrapers that live alongside the shanty slum island called Satellite, where the lower class is basically left off to rot in. Our protagonist, Yusei Fudo, comes from Satellite, and using the motorcycle and car deck he made by recycled trash, decides to follow his former friend Jack Atlas to Neo Domino City to settle a score with him. The show has then him thrown in jail, mugged in the face and abused by the police, and then a lot happens and he finds out he has a role in an actually larger plot. The show deals with police brutality, cults, state control, and lots of cops getting beat up, but grilling pigs is not what we're here for today. Even though you can take my advice to check out this series, as that even the interesting detail that its main story ends at episode 64, with the Revenant 90 episode being a sort of post-game story with also some really cool filler stories. What we are here today to discuss is actually one of these filler stories, the Crush Town arc. The first thing we see in this arc is Yusei riding alone to this remote point in the desert, where he finds dual discs planted in the ground like the swords in Seven Samurai, like the grave. If you think this might be a stretch already, this is the same show that references Kumunosujo, like the Kowi Castle, with a card, and the same series that has a card with the hand dog, you know, the one from Yojimbo. One big starting difference is that Yusei is not a nameless vagrant here, and he's not looking for money either. He's here to save his friend. The Crash Town arc is both inspired by Yojimbo and a Fistful of Dollars. And since it's 5Ds, instead of regular gangs, we have bike gangs. And since it's also Yu-Gi-Oh!, instead of gun duels, we have card duels. So the friend that Yusei is here to say is his former comrade named Kiryu, who is now a sort of Unosuke-ish Yojimbo for one of the families. Not going into detail about the main plot of 5Ds, Kiryu has done a lot of questionable things in the past, and the guilt of his actions has made him a vagrant in search of a place to die. If you're not familiar also with the Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, the card game they play assumes an interesting narrative element to it, as the cards characters play and how they play them can tell a lot about their personality, even without them specifically telling it aloud. So fittingly, Kiryu's playstyle involves a lot of all or nothing chances, a lot of Russian roulette looking monsters, and not having cards in his hand, which is referenced as the handler's combo, which I'll count as an arm getting cut reference. Considering also that his dual disc, which is the tool that people here use to play card games in the series, is rigged with a bomb that is set to explode alongside his arm if he were to surrender. So in this town, duels are allowed only during sunsets, and each group brings a bodyguard to duel. And when it's over, the loser gets dragged by the coffin makers to the local mines to work until death as slaves. Wearing a Fistful of Dollars poncho, Yusei fights the classic three goons from the beginning of Yojimbo to showcase his ability. And instead of cutting one arm off, he uses a synchro arm, which is a sort of special monster, to do a one-turn free kill, which if you know the game or show just a little bit, you might understand how insane that sounds, and he immediately gets hired on the spot. So Yusei's plan is to beat Kiryu, and when he does, alongside Barbara, who is the one who called Yusei in the first place with a letter, they would make a distraction so that they could save Kiryu. And now hear how it twists from the Yojimbo. So Barbara betrays Yusei and shoots him with a stun round. And the real correspondent to Unosuke of the story, which is this guy called Lotten, I think it might be because he's rotten, arrives. He uses a card that looks like a weird mixture of a Trigon guy, Stroheim from JoJo, and Teiga from BlazBlue, and he one-turn kills the leader of the other gang and takes control of the town, while our heroes are brought to slave camps. After this, the story becomes a classic tale of redemption and rekindling of spirits, and while in town everyone is basically betraying each other, Kiryu finds a new reason to keep living, and like Yojimbo, he and Yusei revive to become two Yojimbos. Kiryu arrives in the town in the Yojimbo style, but actually can be like the Kaiketsu Zubat style, so arriving while playing. And they have a 2v1 duel with Lotten, like in a few dollars more. They also incite a revolt, win, and then, interestingly, there's a variant of the ending. Usually in Yojimbo, everything basically goes to hell. The whole town is in flames, both ruling gangs are all dead, all the inhabitants of the town just leave because there's nothing, and then Toshiro Mifune is like, well, see ya. And leaves, and just leaves. In 5Ds, instead, not only they arrest the gang members without killing them, and convert all the others to stop the criminal stuff, here Kiryu also stays behind and helps rebuild the town. Which is neat. Not bad. Before leaving you, I thought that dropping some honorable mentions, which have minor elements, or that there's not a lot to say, would be a nice thing to do. So here we go. This one fits in easily, as in a sense Star Wars is an amalgamation of films that preceded it, in a way, and Yojimbo is no exception. As a basic example here, we can see some staples like a local thugs losing an arm, a conflict between two factions, where thanks to the protagonist action, the balance of the conflict changes, an arm cut, and even another arm being cut. A lot of arms getting lost in this series is actually. This one could count too, as in part 1 has a very funny version of a hand dog in the form of a cat with a puppy in the mouth, and then immediately after Jonathan meeting 3 thugs and almost losing himself a hand. Part 2 has various hand losses like AC/DC and Joseph. Part 4 has an antagonist obsessed with removed hands. Part 5 has the protagonist infiltrating an evil organization and transforming it from the inside, with also them going through 2 factions fighting. A lot of hand being lost, like Trish Bruno Giorno, and there's also a hostage exchange. Considering the fact that the title of this film is a literal translation of Yojimbo, you could think that there are common elements, but for the most part it's just the name. Except that the Bodyguard has a sword where he lives. I don't know, but I think it's kind of a metaphor for sex. Not sure what it means though.
Guilty Gear Strive.
Strive has a partial nod to Yojimbo, which is present in the character intro between the vampire samurai Nagoriyuki and the Secretary of Absolute Defense Gold Lewis Dickinson, which references the coffin maker present in Yojimbo. And it's neat. Final Fantasy X has a reference to Yojimbo in the form of one of the main summons, namely in fact Yojimbo. They have a Shisa looking dog, and you have to pay them for the services when you summon them. They also have like a move that references the knife that Toshiro Mifune uses to defeat Onosuke at the end of Yojimbo, and another one that kills his opponent in one strike, like the one in the ending of Sanjuro. It's very simple and clean references, and the design is The dichotomy between Spike and Vicious could be easily seen as a sort of portmanteau of the gun versus sword conflict in Yojimbo. Considering that Vicious also does some crime politics within Mafia, the gun versus sword thing is kind of a big thing in Yojimbo, so even like a gun x sword could count for this one. In theory, you could see Big Boss's plan in the Metal Gear spin-offs as a vaguely similar situation, as he basically acts the role of a villain to become a tertiary element in the Cold War, to not have it become hot. And it's the reverse of Hot Cold Man's plan. He also loses an arm, I don't know, he's... Devil May Cry 5 has Nero losing his arm and then acting as a third element in the Dante and Neo dispute, which I'd say it counts most as a nod at most. And now here's something for you to think about. Open your third eye and start to think which films, series, games, anything has this sort of narrative to it. Start thinking in this way, for example. For example, how could Mean Girls fall in this category? Try to tell me. And yeah, this is the video. I hope you liked it. Next up, I'm going to talk about how culture itself influences narrative. First it was characters, second was structure, and the third one I thought was myths, culture, religions. Not sure how people would like it, but I hope you like it. Yeah, that's it. I think I'll stop here, and I might come back to these films for you, like Kurosawa films in the future. I really like his works. I watched all his films recently, like all of them in order, and I think I might have things to add on his works because they're really good. Yeah, I'll have to see. I'll tell you soon enough. So for now, I will say bye. See you in the future.